Traffic. Oh my God, I am so late. Excuse me. Can you move your car? There are people behind you who actually have somewhere to be.
Wow.
Hello, can't you hear me?
She was already 7 minutes late, and New York City did not care. Cassie Hart gripped her steering wheel so hard her knuckles ached. The traffic on Fifth Avenue was swallowed whole, bumper to bumper, horns screaming into the morning air, nobody moving, nobody explaining why. She had a patient on that table, a real human being with a real chest cracked open, waiting on her hands, and the city was sitting here acting like time was a suggestion. She checked her phone. Her senior resident had texted twice. "Where are you?" Then 30 seconds later, "Dr. Hart, we need you now." Asterisk. Cassie exhaled through her nose and looked ahead. The line of cars stretched for what looked like half a mile. And right there at the very front of it all, blocking an entire lane with the casual arrogance of someone who had never been told no, sat a sleek, black Rolls-Royce that hadn't moved in 4 minutes. For minutes, she stared at it. Then she looked at her phone. Then she looked back at the car. Something snapped inside her. Cassie unbuckled her seatbelt. The woman beside her in the next lane watched with wide eyes as Cassie pushed her car door open and stepped out into the middle of Fifth Avenue in her white coat, her badge swinging, her heels hitting the asphalt like punctuation marks. She walked past 3 cars, then 4. People were watching. She didn't care. She stopped at the Rolls-Royce and knocked on the window. Not a soft knock. A real one. Nothing happened. She knocked again. Harder. The window came down slowly, the way expensive things always moved. Unhurried. Unbothered, like the concept of urgency didn't apply to whoever was sitting inside. And then Cassie saw him. Nim Jun was not what she expected. He was younger than she'd assumed. Sharp jawline, dark eyes that caught the morning light, dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than 3 of her monthly salaries combined. He had the kind of face that made people stop mid-sentence. But Cassie Hart was not people. "Excuse me," she said, and her voice was steady, direct, no apology in it anywhere. "Can you move your car? There are people behind you who actually have somewhere to be." Nim Jun looked at her. Not through her, not past her, at her. Like she was the most interesting thing that had happened to him in a very long time. A slow smile crossed his face, and he said nothing for a moment, just watching her with those dark eyes, and Cassie felt a flicker of irritation rise up her spine. "Did you hear me?" she said. "I heard you," he said. His English was smooth, unhurried, carrying just the faintest trace of an accent that somehow made every word land softer than it should have. "Then can you move?" He tilted his head slightly. The smile didn't leave. Then he raised one hand, one single, elegant hand, and said, "Yes, I will." Cassie stared at him for half a second longer than she intended to. Then she turned on her heel and walked back to her car without another word. She didn't say thank you. She didn't look back. She had a patient waiting and a surgery to perform, and absolutely no time to think about dark eyes or expensive suits, or the way that man had smiled at her like she'd just made his entire morning. She had no idea she'd just made his entire year. If you're new here, welcome to Afro Seoul Mafia Diaries, where love hits hardest when nobody's looking for it. Make sure you're subscribed so you never miss a story, and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. We genuinely want to know. Now let's get back to it. The Rolls-Royce moved. Nim Jun watched her walk away in his side mirror. White coat, steady stride, not a single glance back, and something shifted inside his chest. Not dramatically, not like the movies, just quietly, the way a door opens when you didn't know it was closed. Victor, his personal assistant, and the closest thing he had to a real friend, turned from the passenger seat with one eyebrow raised. "That was unexpected," Victor said. "Yes," Nim Jun said, still watching the mirror. "She had no idea who you were." "No," Nim Jun said. "She didn't." Victor studied his employer's face for a moment. He had worked for Nim Jun for 6 years. He had seen him negotiate billion-dollar deals without blinking. He had seen him walk into rooms that went silent the moment his name was announced. He had never once seen him look like this, quietly undone by a woman in a white coat who hadn't even asked his name. "Nim Jun," Victor said slowly. "We're already late for the Haesung meeting." "I know," Nim Jun said. But he didn't reach for his phone. He didn't open his laptop. He just sat there as the car finally pulled forward into moving traffic, and he thought about the way she'd knocked on his window like she had every right in the world to demand his attention. She did, he thought. She absolutely did. Does Cassie have any idea the man she just dismissed is one of the most powerful men in New York? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if you're loving this story already, hit that like button. It helps more than you know. Cassie made it to the hospital with 4 minutes to spare. She scrubbed in fast, snapped her gloves on, and walked into that operating room like the last hour hadn't happened. The moment she stepped through those doors, everything else fell away. The traffic, the horns, the man in the Rolls Royce with the unhurried smile. None of it existed in here. In here there was only the patient, the monitors, and the work. "Glad you made it, Dr. Hart," her senior resident Daniel said from across the table. There was relief in his voice wrapped loosely around something that almost sounded like sarcasm. "I'm always going to make it," Cassie said without looking up. Retractor. The surgery took 4 hours and 12 minutes. When it was done, Cassie pulled off her gloves, checked the post-op notes, spoke briefly with the patient's family in the waiting room, and then finally, allowed herself to sit down in the break room with a cup of coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes ago. She sat in the quiet and stared at the wall. And for reasons she absolutely refused to examine, her mind drifted back to Fifth Avenue. She thought about the way the window had come down slowly. The suit, the jaw, the smile that arrived before the words did, like he already knew something she didn't. She thought about how he'd raised that one hand, so calm, so unbothered, and simply said yes. Not defensively, not with attitude, just yes. Cassie took a sip of her cold coffee and frowned at nothing. "You're thinking about someone," said a voice from the doorway. She looked up. Her best friend and fellow surgeon Dr. Imani Rhodes was leaning against the door frame with a cup of actual hot coffee and the specific expression she wore when she already knew the answer to a question she hadn't asked yet. "I'm thinking about my post-op notes," Cassie said. "You're staring at a blank wall with that little crease between your eyebrows," Imani said, walking in and sitting across from her. "That's not post-op notes. That's a person. It's nobody." "Cassie." "Imani." Imani sat back and crossed her arms and waited. She had learned years ago that waiting was the only tool that worked on Cassie Hart. Push and she'd shut down completely. Wait, and eventually the words came out on their own. Cassie lasted about 40 seconds. "There was a man," she said, "in traffic this morning. His car was blocking the lane, so I got out and knocked on his window." Imani's eyes went wide. "You got out of your car." "I was late." "Cassie, you got out of your car on Fifth Avenue. The point is I told him to move, and he just smiled. Like I was amusing to him. Like I was some kind of entertainment." She said it with irritation, but even she could hear that the irritation was thin, stretched over something else she didn't have a name for yet. Imani stared at her. Then a slow smile spread across her face. "He was attractive," Imani said. "I didn't say that. You didn't have to. You've been sitting here staring at a wall thinking about a man you met for 30 seconds in traffic. He was definitely attractive." Cassie opened her mouth. Then she closed it. Then she picked up her cold coffee and took another sip and said nothing, which was the loudest answer she could have given. Imani laughed, warm and delighted, and Cassie pointed at her across the table. "Don't," Cassie said. "I haven't said anything. You're thinking very loudly." "I'm just sitting here drinking my coffee," Imani said, and smiled into her cup. Cassie set her coffee down and stood up. She had rounds in 20 minutes and 3 follow-up consults after that, and absolutely no business thinking about a man in a Rolls Royce who smiled like the world moved at his pace, and not a second faster. She was a surgeon. She had a life that ran on precision and discipline, and there was no room in that life for dark eyes and slow smiles and hands raised with that kind of quiet, devastating confidence. None at all. She grabbed her clipboard and walked out of the break room and told herself firmly that she would not think about him again. She thought about him twice more before lunch. Meanwhile, 40 blocks uptown, Nim Jun was sitting in a boardroom surrounded by 12 of the most powerful real estate developers in New York City, and he was barely present for any of it. Victor noticed. The Haesung Group meeting had been 18 months in the making. A $2.3 billion mixed-use development deal that would reshape an entire section of Lower Manhattan. Nim Jun had personally driven every stage of the negotiation. He knew the numbers cold, knew every stakeholder's pressure point, knew exactly which concessions to offer and which ones to hold back. He could have run this meeting in his sleep. But right now Victor was watching him sit at the head of that table with his eyes slightly distant, his pen turning slowly between his fingers, and the very specific expression of a man whose mind was somewhere else entirely. Victor leaned over quietly and said, "The Meridian Clause. They're waiting." Nim Jun blinked, refocused. He looked around the table and then said, smoothly and without hesitation, exactly the right thing about the Meridian Clause, and the room nodded and moved forward, and nobody noticed the half-second gap except Victor. After the meeting, when the room had cleared and it was just the two of them left with the remnants of expensive coffee and a table full of folders, Victor sat down and looked at his employer directly. "You want to talk about it?" Victor said. "The Meridian Clause was fine," Nim Jun said, closing a folder. "I'm not talking about the Meridian Clause, and you know it." Nim Jun was quiet for a moment. Then he set the folder down and leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling like the answer to something might be written up there. I don't know her name, he said. Victor nodded slowly. Okay. I don't know where she works. I don't know anything about her except that she's a doctor, and she knocked on my window on 5th Avenue and told me to move my car and then walked away without looking back. And Nim Jun looked at him. And I think I need to find her. Victor held his gaze for a long moment. Then he exhaled and reached for his own coffee and said, she was wearing a hospital badge. Nim Jun straightened slightly. I saw it when she walked away, Victor said. It was a Mount Sinai badge. The silence in the boardroom stretched for exactly 3 seconds. Clear my afternoon, Nim Jun said. Oh, he's already looking for her, and she has no idea. What do you think happens when Nim Jun shows up at her hospital? Comment below, and make sure you've liked this video. We're just getting started. Mount Sinai Hospital on a Tuesday afternoon was controlled chaos. Nurses moved in tight, efficient lines. Gurneys rolled past with quiet urgency. The PA system called out codes and names in a flat, steady voice that somehow made everything sound both routine and critical at the same time. It was the kind of place where every second had a purpose and every person walked like they knew exactly where they were going. Nim Jun walked through the front entrance like he owned it. He didn't have an appointment. He didn't have a patient name. He had a description, a badge glimpsed in a side mirror, and the kind of quiet certainty that had built him a $2 billion empire from the ground up. He approached the reception desk, and the young woman behind it looked up and visibly straightened without fully understanding why. I'm looking for a female surgeon, Nim Jun said. She was on 5th Avenue this morning around 8:15. White coat, hospital badge. She would have come in for an emergency surgery. The receptionist blinked. Sir, we have several surgeons on staff. I can't just. Her first name might start with AC. Victor said quietly from beside him, because he had noticed the small initials on the badge too. The receptionist looked between them. I really can't give out staff information too. I'm not asking for her address, Nim Jun said, and his voice was patient, unhurried, the way it always was when he wanted something badly enough to be careful about it. I just want to leave something for her. A name and a number. That's all. The receptionist hesitated. Then a voice behind Nim Jun said, Can I help you? He turned around. It wasn't her. It was a tall woman in scrubs with sharp eyes and a direct expression, holding a tablet against her chest and looking at Nim Jun with the careful assessment of someone who was very good at reading situations quickly. I'm Dr. Imani Rhodes, she said. Is there a problem at reception? No problem, Nim Jun said. I'm looking for a colleague of yours. A surgeon. We had a brief encounter this morning, and I wanted to introduce myself properly. Imani looked at him. Really looked at him. The suit, the composure, the quiet authority that radiated off him without any visible effort. Then something shifted in her expression. Not suspicion exactly. More like recognition of a specific type of situation she found personally delightful. Brief encounter, she repeated. On 5th Avenue, he said. Around 8:15. Imani's eyes went wide for just a fraction of a second before she controlled her expression back to neutral. She knew exactly who he was talking about. She had sat across from Cassie Hart an hour ago and watched her stare at a blank wall thinking about a man she'd met in traffic and claim it was nothing. It was very clearly not nothing. And your name? Imani asked. Nim Jun. She studied him for another moment. Then she said, Wait here, and walked away before he could say another word. Cassie was in the middle of writing post-op notes when Imani appeared in the doorway of her office with an expression that could only be described as gleeful. You need to come with me, Imani said. I have 3 consults, Cassie said without looking up. Cassie. Imani, I'm serious. I don't have time. The man from the Rolls-Royce is standing at our reception desk. The pen stopped moving. Cassie looked up slowly. What? Tall, Korean, suit that costs more than my car. Came here asking for a surgeon from 5th Avenue this morning. Imani leaned against the door frame with her arms crossed and the smile of someone who had been vindicated completely. He found you, Cassie. He actually came here. Cassie set her pen down very carefully. Something moved through her chest that she immediately identified as irritation and absolutely nothing else. He came to my workplace, she said. Romantically, Imani offered. Imani, that is not romantic, that is. He doesn't know your name. He only knew you worked here from your badge. He came anyway. Imani tilted her head. If that was in a movie, you'd be crying right now. I don't cry at movies, Cassie said, standing up and smoothing her coat. And this is not a movie. This is my place of work, and some man I told to move his car has shown up here, and I am going to go out there and make it very clear that you thought about him twice before lunch. Imani said sweetly. Cassie stopped walking, turned around, pointed at her best friend with a look that could have stripped paint. Imani just smiled and gestured toward the hallway. He's waiting. Nim Jun heard her before he saw her. Not her voice, her energy. A shift in the atmosphere of the corridor, a kind of focused, purposeful movement that made him turn before she'd fully rounded the corner. And then there she was. White coat, badge, the same direct expression she'd worn on Fifth Avenue. Except now there was something else layered underneath it. Something she was working to keep off her face and not entirely succeeding. She stopped a few feet from him and looked at him with her arms loosely crossed and said, "You came to my hospital." "I did," he said. "Why?" "Because I didn't get your name this morning." Cassie looked at him steadily. "I didn't offer it." "No," he said. "You didn't." He held her gaze, and there was that smile again, arriving just ahead of his words, quiet and certain. "I'm Nim Jun." She said nothing. "And you are," he said. "Busy," she said. Behind her, just far enough away to pretend she wasn't listening, Imani made a sound that she quickly disguised as a cough. Nim Jun's smile deepened fractionally. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced a simple white card. No logo, no title, just a name and a number printed in clean dark type, and held it out to her. Cassie looked at the card. Then she looked at him. She didn't take it. "Mr. Kim," she said, and her voice was measured, professional, giving nothing away. "I appreciate that you came here, but I don't know you. I asked you to move your car this morning because I had a patient in surgery. That was a professional necessity, not an invitation." "I know that," he said. The card was still extended. He hadn't moved. "Then you understand why I'm not taking your card." "I understand why you think you shouldn't," he said quietly. The corridor was very still for a moment. Somewhere down the hall a monitor beeped in a steady rhythm. Cassie held his gaze and felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. The slight, uncomfortable awareness of being truly seen by someone. Not assessed. Not evaluated. Seen. She didn't like it. She took the card. She didn't know why she took it. She told herself it was to end the interaction efficiently. She told herself she would throw it away the moment she got back to her office. She held it between two fingers like it was a piece of evidence rather than something that mattered, and she said, "Goodbye, Mr. Kim," and turned and walked back down the corridor without looking back. Nim Jun watched her go. Victor appeared at his shoulder. "She took the card," he said, with the quiet satisfaction of a man whose confidence in the situation had never wavered. "She took the card," Nim Jun confirmed. "And she's going to throw it away," Victor said. "Probably," Nim Jun said. "But she took it." Nim Jun turned toward the exit with the calm, unhurried stride of a man who understood that the best things in life rarely moved on the first day. "She took it," he said simply. And that was enough. For now, that was more than enough. She took the card, but she's not calling. Or is she? Drop a comment right now. Do you think Cassie is going to reach out, or is she going to make him work for it? If this story has you hooked, hit that like button and subscribe. Cassie threw the card away. She walked straight back to her office, sat down, placed it on her desk for exactly 45 seconds, and then picked it up and dropped it cleanly into the wastebasket beside her chair. Then she picked up her pen and went back to her post-op notes like the last 20 minutes hadn't happened at all. She lasted 3 hours. It was the night shift that did it. The hospital quieted down around 10 p.m., that specific late-night stillness where the fluorescent lights felt louder than the hallways and the exhaustion of a full day settled into your bones like something permanent. Cassie sat in her office with her third coffee of the day and stared at the wastebasket. She was not going to reach into a wastebasket for a man's business card. She was absolutely not going to do that. She did it anyway. She smoothed the card out on her desk and looked at it for a long time. Just a name and a number. No title. No company. No indication of who Nim Jun actually was beyond a man in a very expensive car who smiled like he had never once been told no and somehow didn't seem arrogant about it. That was the part that bothered her. She knew how to handle arrogance. She dealt with it daily, in boardrooms disguised as operating theaters, in senior consultants who spoke over her, in men who looked at her credentials and then looked at her face and decided to be surprised. Arrogance she could dismiss without a second thought. But Nim Jun hadn't been arrogant. He'd been certain. Those were two entirely different things, and Cassie Hart was self-aware enough to know exactly which one was harder to walk away from. She turned the card over in her fingers. Then she picked up her phone. She didn't call. She was not ready to call. She typed a text instead, which felt safer somehow, less like a decision and more like a footnote. "This is the surgeon from Fifth Avenue. I'm not interested in whatever this is, but it would have been rude not to acknowledge that you came all the way here." She stared at the message for a full minute. Then she sent it before she could talk herself out of it, and put her phone face down on the desk and went back to her notes. 11 seconds later, her phone vibrated. She turned it over. "I appreciate the text, Dr." One word. A question mark. He was still asking for her name. Cassie stared at the message and felt something move through her that was dangerously close to amusement. She typed back, "Good night, Mr. Kim." His response came in 4 seconds flat. Good night. I'll find out eventually. Cassie put her phone down. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she sat in her quiet office at 10:30 at night and smiled at absolutely nothing. She didn't text him again for 5 days. She told herself she was busy, which was true. She had 2 major surgeries, a research presentation, and a departmental review that ate her entire Thursday. She told herself she wasn't thinking about him, which was less true. He appeared in the background of her thoughts at inconvenient moments, during her morning run, between surgeries, once at 2 in the morning when she couldn't sleep and lay in the dark staring at her ceiling, trying to identify exactly what it was about him that kept surfacing. It wasn't the looks, though the looks were not a problem for him. It wasn't the money. Cassie had worked too hard for her own success to be impressed by someone else's wealth. It was something quieter than both of those things. It was the way he'd stood in her hospital corridor holding out that card without any desperation in him anywhere. Like he wasn't afraid of the answer. Like he had already decided she was worth the patience and was prepared to wait as long as the waiting took. Cassie had spent her entire adult life around people who wanted things from her quickly. Her time, her expertise, her attention, her emotional availability. Everyone always needed Cassie Hart to show up fast and give everything she had. Nim Jun was the first person in recent memory who seemed perfectly content to simply wait. That undid her more than anything else could have. On day 5 she picked up her phone. Do you always track down women who tell you to move your car? His reply came within a minute. She got the feeling he hadn't been far from his phone either, though she wasn't ready to examine what that meant. Only the ones who walk away without looking back. Cassie read the message twice. Then she typed, "That's a terrible habit." Probably, he wrote back. "Are you free on Saturday?" And there it was. Direct, no performance around it, no elaborate build-up. Just the question sitting there on her screen, waiting for an honest answer. Cassie set her phone down and walked to her kitchen and poured a glass of water and drank half of it standing at the sink looking out at the New York skyline glittering through her window. She thought about the wastebasket. She thought about the card she'd smoothed out at 10:30 at night. She thought about smiling at nothing in a quiet hospital office like some version of herself she barely recognized. She went back to her phone. I have rounds until 2. She watched the 3 dots appear and disappear and appear again. 3 o'clock. I know a place on the Upper West Side. No pressure. Just coffee. Just coffee. As if anything about Kim Nim Jun suggested just anything. Cassie exhaled slowly through her nose. Then she typed the 3 most dangerous words she had said in a very long time. Fine. 3 o'clock. She put her phone down and immediately questioned every decision she had ever made that had led to this moment. Imani was going to be insufferable about this. Cassie was not going to tell Imani about this. Imani was going to find out anyway because Imani always found out, and when she did the smugness was going to be completely unbearable. Cassie's phone buzzed one more time. I'm looking forward to it, dear. She laughed out loud in her empty apartment. An actual laugh, surprised out of her before she could catch it. She typed back 2 words. Still no. And then she went to bed and slept better than she had in weeks. Saturday arrived the way important days always did, feeling deceptively ordinary until it didn't. Cassie finished her rounds at 1:50, changed out of her scrubs in the locker room, and stood in front of the mirror for exactly 4 minutes longer than she normally would, and then was annoyed at herself for it. She wore a deep burgundy wrap dress and her good coat, and the simple gold earrings Imani had given her for her birthday 2 years ago. She looked like herself. She looked like a woman who had made a sensible, low-stakes decision to have coffee with someone she barely knew and was completely unbothered by it. She took the subway to the Upper West Side and walked 2 blocks to the address he'd sent, and stopped outside a small, warm-lit cafe tucked between a bookstore and a flower shop, the kind of place that looked like it had existed for 40 years and intended to exist for 40 more. Through the window, she could see dark wood and low lighting and 2 people at a corner table speaking quietly, and she thought, this is not a power move. He didn't pick somewhere loud or impressive or designed to make her feel small. He picked somewhere quiet. She pushed open the door. Nim Jun was already there. He stood when he saw her, not performatively, not with any theater to it, just a natural, unhurried rise from his chair the way someone stands when a person they've been genuinely looking forward to seeing finally walks through the door. He was in a dark navy sweater and dark trousers, and he looked different without the suit. Softer somehow. More real. You came, he said. I said I would. Cassie said, sitting down across from him and placing her bag on the empty chair beside her with the calm efficiency of a woman who needed to have at least one thing in the situation under her control. You did, he agreed, and settled back into his seat, and looked at her with those same steady dark eyes that had first caught her through a car window on Fifth Avenue. Dr. Cassie, she said finally. and watched something shift warmly in his expression. Cassie Hart. Cassie, he said, like he was placing the word carefully somewhere it would stay. It suits you. Don't do that, she said. Do what? Say smooth things. I can't tell if you mean them, and it's distracting. Nim Jun looked at her for a moment. Then he said, I always mean what I say. That's something you'll find out about me if you give it enough time. Cassie picked up the menu and looked at it, even though she already knew she was ordering coffee. I haven't agreed to give anything time, she said. No, he said. But you're here. She looked at him over the top of the menu. He looked back at her with that quiet certainty that she was beginning to understand was simply the way he existed in the world, not as performance, not as strategy, just as fact. She put the menu down. Tell me about yourself, she said. And don't make it sound like a pitch. He smiled. And for the next 2 hours, Nim Jun talked to Cassie Hart like she was the only person in the room, and Cassie Hart listened and pushed back and challenged him and laughed twice without meaning to. And somewhere between the first coffee and the second, the space between them on that small table felt like it was getting smaller without either of them moving at all. She showed up. He was already there. And something is shifting whether Cassie wants to admit it or not. Do you think she's falling for him? Comment below and let us know. The second date happened without either of them calling it a date. Nim Jun texted her on Tuesday morning, not with an invitation, just a question. Have you eaten? It was 7:45 a.m. and Cassie was between rounds, and the answer was no, but she almost said yes out of instinct, because saying no felt like admitting something. She typed back, why? There's a place 2 blocks from Mount Sinai that makes the best breakfast in the city. I happen to be in the neighborhood. Cassie stared at her phone in the corridor outside the nurse's station with a very specific expression of someone who knew exactly what was happening and was choosing to step into it anyway. You happen to be in the neighborhood, she typed back. Remarkable coincidence, he replied immediately. She laughed before she could stop herself. A passing nurse glanced at her, and Cassie straightened her face and typed back, 20 minutes. Don't be late. He was already at the table when she arrived. They ate breakfast in the easy, unhurried way of 2 people who had known each other much longer than they actually had, trading opinions, disagreeing about things that didn't matter, agreeing about things that did. Nim Jun told her about growing up in Seoul, about arriving in New York at 23 with a plan so detailed it had taken up an entire notebook and the absolute refusal to let the city beat him. Cassie told him about medical school in Baltimore, about the specific exhaustion of being the only black woman in certain rooms, about the morning she decided she was going to stop making herself smaller to make other people comfortable and never went back. Nim Jun listened to that last part the way people listened when something mattered to them. Fully. Without planning his response while she was still talking. You never went back, he said. Never, she said. Good, he said simply, and meant it so completely that Cassie felt it land somewhere underneath her ribs and stay there. She got back to the hospital 6 minutes late for her first consult and did not regret a single one of them. It was Imani who finally broke her open. 3 weeks after the cafe on the Upper West Side, after 4 breakfasts and 2 dinners, and 1 long Sunday afternoon walk through Central Park that neither of them had planned and neither of them had wanted to end, Imani cornered Cassie in the locker room after a double shift and looked at her with the eyes of someone who had been patient long enough. Talk to me, Imani said. I'm fine, Cassie said, pulling her hair back. You're scared, Imani said. Cassie's hand stilled. She looked at her reflection in the mirror for a moment, and then looked at Imani, and the carefully constructed wall she'd been maintaining for 3 weeks developed a very visible crack right down the middle. He's too certain, Cassie said quietly. About everything. About me. And I don't know what to do with that, because nobody has ever been that certain about me without wanting something in return. Imani was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Has he asked for anything? Cassie thought about it. 3 weeks of mornings and evenings and conversations that ran longer than they were supposed to. 3 weeks of Nim Jun showing up exactly when he said he would and leaving when she needed space and never once making her feel like his patience had an expiration date on it. No, she said. Nothing. Then what are you afraid of? Imani asked. And Cassie Hart, who had performed 8-hour surgeries without her hands shaking, who had stood in the middle of Fifth Avenue and knocked on a billionaire's window without a moment's hesitation, who had built her entire life on the bedrock of her own nerve, looked at her best friend and said very quietly that it's real, and I ruin it. Imani crossed the space between them and put both hands on Cassie's shoulders and looked her directly in the eye. Cassie, she said, that man came to your hospital because he saw your badge in a side mirror. He has shown up every single time. He has been patient in a way that men like that are not supposed to know how to be. She squeezed her shoulders once. Stop protecting yourself from something that is already good. Cassie looked at her for a long moment. Then she picked up her phone. Nim Jun was in his office on the 42nd floor when the call came through. It was after 8 p.m., and Victor had gone home an hour ago, and the city spread out below him in a vast glittering grid that he had looked at thousands of times without it meaning what it meant right now. He picked up on the second ring. "Cassie," he said. "I have a question," she said. No greeting, straight to the point, pure Cassie Hart. "Ask it," he said. A pause. Short but real, the kind that meant the next words had weight. "Why me?" she said. "You could have let it go after Fifth Avenue. You could have let it go after the hospital. You could have stopped at any point and found someone easier, and you didn't. So I want to know why. Not the smooth answer. The real one." Nim Jun was quiet for a moment. He looked out at the city. Then he said, "Because you knocked on my window." "That's not an answer," she said. "It is," he said. "Every person in that traffic that morning sat in their car and accepted it. You got out. You walked up and you knocked, and you looked at me like I was just a person who needed to move and not someone to be managed or impressed. Do you understand how rare that is for me? You didn't want anything from me. You just wanted me to do the right thing." He paused. "I've been surrounded by people who want things from me my entire adult life. And you stood there in your white coat and wanted nothing except basic human decency. I didn't stand a chance, Cassie." The line was quiet for a long moment. "That was the smooth answer," she said, but her voice had changed. Something in it had softened around the edges in a way she wasn't trying to hide anymore. "No," he said. "That was the real one. The smooth answer would have been shorter." She laughed. That real laugh he had been collecting like something precious every time he managed to pull it out of her. "I'm not easy," she said. "I know," he said. "I work impossible hours, and I'm stubborn, and I don't do well with people who can't handle honesty." "I know that too," he said. "And I threw your card in the wastebasket," she said. "I assumed," he said, and she could hear the smile in it. "I took it back out," she said quietly. The silence between them this time was different from all the ones that had come before it. It was full rather than empty, warm rather than careful. "Cassie," he said. "Yes. Have dinner with me tomorrow. Not breakfast. Not coffee. Dinner. A real one." She took a breath. And Nim Jun, who had built an empire on the ability to read a room, who had sat in 1,000 negotiations and known exactly which way they were going to fall before anyone else did, held his phone and waited with his heart, doing something it had never done in a boardroom in his life. "What time?" she said. He closed his eyes for just a second. 7. "Don't be late," she said. "I'm never late," he said. "Neither am I," she said. "Good night, Nim Jun." Not Mr. Kim. Nim Jun. For the first time, just Nim Jun, and the way it sounded in her voice was worth every moment of every patient day he had spent getting here. "Good night, Cassie," he said. She hung up and stood in her apartment with the city humming quietly outside her window, and her heart doing something large and unfamiliar and completely terrifying in her chest. She pressed her phone against her sternum and breathed and let it happen. Let it be real. Let herself want it without immediately building a wall around the wanting. In his office 42 floors above the city, Nim Jun set his phone down on his desk and looked out at the New York skyline and smiled the way he had smiled in a side mirror on Fifth Avenue. Quietly, privately, like a man who had just watched the best thing that was ever going to happen to him walk toward him instead of away. Victor appeared in the doorway. He had come back for a forgotten folder and now stood looking at his employer with the knowing expression of a man who had been right about something from the very beginning and was too good a friend to say so out loud. Nim Jun looked at him. Victor picked up his folder. "Don't," Nim Jun said. "I haven't said a word," Victor said. "You're thinking very loudly," Nim Jun said. Victor smiled and walked back out. And Nim Jun turned back to the window and thought about a woman in a white coat on Fifth Avenue who had knocked on his window like she had every right in the world to demand the best of him. She did, he thought. She absolutely did. And this time he was going to make sure she knew it. If this story gave you all the feels, hit that like button right now, subscribe to Afro Seoul Mafia Diaries so you never miss a single story, and drop a comment below telling us your favorite moment from this series. Was it the window knock? The wastebasket? That phone call? Let us know. We read every single one. See you in the next story.